Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where we take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. This video will be reviewing the adventure Death by Goblins, designed by Gordon McAlpin for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider using my affiliate links for your online shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/RogueWatson. Shouts to Platinum patrons Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Manuel, Basil, Tom, Huskar124, Wizard Princess, my favorite D&D player, and Christopher. And gold patrons RPG Papercrafts, Charmer Grenade, Pretty Boy, Yuma, Marcos De Vicente, Gilberto, Sean A.K., Cert, 2B, Adam, Dead Lizard Lion, Sam, Arash, Limpy Spuds, Jerome, Fatboy619, Sclinia, Nick. Thank you all very much for your support. I'm going to say it right now. Death by Goblins is one of my favorite adventures that I have reviewed this year. Last year I did a top 10 list of all the products I'd reviewed in a year, which was a lot. And Death by Goblins, I'm telling you right now, will not only be the top 10, but is in serious contention for my number one favorite product I have reviewed this year. It is that good. It says it's a short adventure. It is not a short adventure in a good way. First of all, the entire thing is 70 pages long. The actual adventure itself is 40 pages long, which is not short, and then has 20 pages of appendices. Death by Goblins is a adventure for a 6th level party. It has a fantastic opening hook where it introduces the BBEG, the big bad evil guy, early on in whatever the adventure's campaign is, and they're a just delightfully fantastic character that's just a pompous villain that you just love to hate. Very well written, very funny. And then that character becomes the surprise villain for this entire tribe of goblins. The party is, later on in their career, thrown into this dungeon where they then have to battle their way out of. It's an incredible dungeon design with excellent maps, full-color battle maps. We get tokens that are provided for stuff like Roll20. Gordon is a excellent artist and cartoonist, and the artwork is phenomenal throughout, including comic panels and original artwork, all the way, and including this awesome cover art. And it does really fun things with goblins, which are normally a ubiquitous creature that is always used in D&D. So you're thinking, oh my gosh, another adventure that's got goblins in it. And this does such a good job of making the dungeon dynamic and interesting, and also giving the goblins a huge amount of personality and various expanded actions and stat blocks, and making this whole area just feel like a living, breathing dungeon ecosystem where so many dungeons, it really feels like you're just going room to room. Maybe individual dungeons are kind of well designed and have cool things about them, but it just feels like you're completing each room separately. And the best dungeons, they really feel like a layer where creatures like live and eat and work and do other things, live, basically. And this one creates that and has the added benefit of dumping the players into a dangerous death trap dungeon at the very bottom layer of this mega dungeon, and then they have to fight their way out of, and that's basically the entire adventure. It's absolutely phenomenal. It's well designed. I'm gushing because I fell in love with this adventure. I could see myself running this adventure with my group, which is very high praise. And you could do it if you introduce the villain early, which is a very tricky thing to do. And I've not really seen an adventure do this before. And it's fascinating. Essentially, Chapter 1, it's divided into 4 chapters. The majority of the adventure is Chapter 3, which is the mega dungeon, and the boss battles at Chapter 4. Chapter 1, introduces our villain, which is this snotty, pompous elf named Elias. I'm just going to read you this one clip because I busted out laughing. A fair-skinned sun elf with black hair and piercing green eyes, Elias would be considered extremely handsome by most anyone's estimation. The son of a long line of famed musicians, Elias spent years pursuing a career as a lutist, but he never achieved the level of success he felt he deserved. Frustrated, he turned to the arcane arts in which he excelled almost immediately. But Elias is a dick. And then it goes on to describe how much of a dick he is and the bad things he's done. He's, controlling. He's just a toxic dude, which I think is a really funny, relevant way to build a villain. Not necessarily a mustache twirling and not really that evil, dark arts and stuff. No, he just uses charming magic and stuff, but he's just a toxic asshole. Very controlling and just nasty. And I think that's an awesome character for a villain. And the way he's introduced is by having this social role-playing scene at an inn, and this one is specifically written to go along with Lost Mines of Phandelver or Icespire Peak, in which it uses the whatever the Phandalin Inn is called, Stonehill, I think, which is smart because that's what a lot of players are using. But the idea is you introduce the villain through this event that just seems like a fun little side, role-playing jaunt for your players to engage in, which is he's a bard, there's an open mic night, there's other patrons that are there that can sing and do their thing. There's a lumberjack, juggling hand axes, and of course the players are encouraged to do stuff too. And he always goes, and it's supposed to be this funny moment where he's just not very good, but he's a total asshole about it and thinks he's amazing, and of course uses magic to trick a lot of patrons into thinking he's amazing and all that. And it's just supposed to be like this kind of funny one-off event that the players, just treat as kind of this random social sequence that they can then forget about. But you're supposed to make sure that he, in some way blames the characters. Blames the characters or gets into some kind of tizzy. It's not supposed to be a combat or anything, and it even mentions that, the innkeeper can come up and kind of mollify everybody, but you're supposed to make it so that definitely at least it makes sense for him to have motivation to get revenge on the players, whereas the players might not really care because, well, who cares? You're just some random bard. And that's assuming it goes off well, and we're going to get into how that also needs to go off well in the next chapter, that could work really, really well. And I've not seen another adventure try to do that, where it says, hey, my adventure is for this level and has this villain, but I want to introduce my villain earlier in the player's career, in the campaign, as this kind of just random one-off, even though he's very powerful, but his whole motivation is just wants people to love him, and I think that's an awesome way to introduce a main villain. Now, Chapter 2 gets a little problematic, so we've fast-forwarded through the characters' campaign, they're later on, and they just get ambushed by goblins. And for the longest time, you don't know who's behind it. You don't know why these goblins are ambushing you or what's going on. This is very tricky to pull off, because this adventure requires the DM to capture the players. And that is a very, very difficult thing to do. I've wrestled with that myself during our previous campaign, and I'm still not sure there's a good way to do it. I mean, I don't necessarily think that just waving it to a cutscene is the right way to go, because that loses the player's agency, but players are never going to want to just surrender. Now, they don't surrender here. What happens is they're supposed to blunder into, which I love that we get a comic art panel here, blunder into this trap. It's like a classic pit trap, but the pit trap actually holds a teleportation circle that then teleports them into the dungeon. And they come across, a halfling with a murdered, her husband's been murdered, and they're supposed to help her. It's a goblin in disguise, and there's other goblins that are like firing at the players, and they basically rush up and try to shove them into the pit. But that's basically all the notes we get, which is odd because the dungeon is so well detailed and designed. Once we get to the dungeon, it's almost over-designed, which is good. I mean, I'd rather have more information than not as much information as I would like. I feel like this chapter really needed a little bit more, because it's very hard to capture players, and all you're giving me is, it just says, introduce additional goblins, archers, hunters, wolf riders, as needed to force the characters into the pit. Should any characters be reduced to 0 hit points, they're knocked out instead of killed, and the goblins push their bodies into the pit. But nothing, I mean, there's no notes on what happens if a character just teleports away and runs off and hides. Like, unfortunately, it breaks the adventure because it requires all of the players to be teleported into the dungeon, and they end up in this awesome pit trap. So, on the one hand, I like the start of the adventure, and I like how the dungeon starts with the players being captured, but you're always going to run into a tricky situation where how do you actually capture the players without making it be like a bunch of DM cheating or turning it into like a cutscene or something. Like, how do you legitimately capture that, especially with goblins and 6th level parties? And it even says, like, hey, make sure your players probably should be fully rested before doing this. And a fully rested 6th level party isn't really going to struggle with a bunch of goblins, even if they're, and there are expanded goblin stat blocks, and I'll get to that, which is very nice. A bunch of different goblin styles and types to use. But still, you're not giving much to work. I feel like there should be some kind of spell caster there that should cast some kind of lockdown spells, hold person. You need to have multiple avenues and multiple backup plans if you absolutely need to capture the players. You can't just rely on a bunch of goblins moving forward to shove players in there, not when they've got, presumably all these magical abilities and things they can do. And what if they're leery about this whole situation? Somebody rolls, a dispel magic or something in the middle of the pit just because they're wary of something, and then the whole thing falls apart. They're not anywhere near the pit. So that's a negative because the whole adventure requires this to happen, and it's a very hard thing to pull off. You can do that, but you would need more. I need more here, and it's an odd complaint to have for this adventure because the actual dungeon, once we get there in chapter 3, is so well detailed. Here's an area, I was reading chapter 2 thinking, oh man, there's not enough here. I hope there's, what's chapter 3 going to look like? Well, chapter 3 looks really good. It's huge. It's pretty much the rest of the adventure. And to give you an idea, before we even get to the room-to-room breakdown, where it does like G1, G2, G3, there are 5 pages here that goes through goblin patrols and all your customization options, how the goblins in here are different, how they can blow a horn and call more goblins to them, how Elias can spy on the heroes using different magical abilities that he's got. What are the lights like? How big are the ceilings and the tunnels? Like, what are the traps? All of these things you could want, even notes on cave mushrooms that you can get and turn into like poisons or potions and things. All that information is provided here, which is awesome. So already we're off to a good start before we even get to the room-by-room breakdown. And this dungeon is massive. You can see here, as soon as I saw this map, you can probably picture my eyes just lighting up and just falling in love with this. Not only is this an awesome art style, and I adore it, but it's a really cool, well-designed dungeon where you start off in the deepest pits of the cave, and there's like guards everywhere and traps and things. But then you can either make it out of there, either escorted by some goblins or, obviously break out. There's different ways. There's secret doors, there's pressure plates and all that. And then there's all these multiple branching paths, and it's designed in such a fun way that the entire outer ring can be explored, and the goal is to get to the middle, which is this keep. So it's kind of hard to picture on a top-down map, but you're basically in the caverns beneath and around a castle keep that is occupied by goblins. So you start off in these caves going around, and then eventually there's all these different secret doors and paths to make it into the keep, and you're in the lowest levels of the keep, and then you have to battle your way up, or stealth, or whatever methods you use. So I love dungeons that give the players multiple paths, because that is the best, to me, that's the best check mark off of the exploration pillar for D&D. Which is, obviously, dungeons are great at exploring because that's what you're doing, but there's a big difference between a dungeon that's just a cave with, like, a central path and there's multiple offshoots, which is a pretty classic design, versus something that's this kind of a spoke wheel where you can go around and explore all these different areas. I mean, there's a meeting area, there's a section with the animals hanging in there with a portcullis, there's a garden area where they're making all their mushrooms and things, there's a barracks, there's safe houses, there's a waterway that you can scooch underwater and come up in the well. There's a water weird down there that will attack anybody if they're alone. There's a trash heap with a black pudding at the bottom. There's so many different areas and things that you can do, and different ways to get into the keep, and none of them are necessarily the right or wrong way. And it's possible players will miss entirely big, cool things. Like there's a prisoner down here in G10 who has been magically enchanted by Elias and is kind of there as a trap for players to rescue. He's one of the last of another adventuring party that was a halfling adventuring party that had befallen him. I guess run past him, and the players can rescue him, and he'll join them as a party member, but then of course betray them during the big final climactic boss fight because he's been enchanted by Elias to serve him, which is similar to all the goblins. All the goblins are loyal, and that's why they're very powerful and can fight all the players off. And they could miss that completely because they could never end up going down to the lower right corner. They could, get into the keep through the waterway, or get in through different secret doors here, secret tunnels along the basements of the towers. There's all kinds of different methods, and you could skip entire areas or go entire areas, and there's no real right or wrong answer, which this is the right way to design a dungeon, which is give players multiple branching paths, let them choose their route and how they want to handle things, and especially with caves, because the doorways are open, you can kind of show them the next room and see where they want to go, what they want to engage in, but make it so they can't necessarily just skip a whole bunch of content and make it to the final boss. That's a problem that a lot of other dungeons have, is that they'll have different paths, and one of them is hardly anything, and then they're at the boss, and then it's really awkward to be well, do we do the rest of the dungeon or do we just get out? In this case, the main central thing that you have to do is make it to the surface of the keep. So automatically you're having to search around the exterior caves and then make your way into the basement levels of this keep, and then you have to battle your way or climb your way. There's a central chimney that you can climb your way up if you douse the flames. There's just a lot of cool stuff going on in this dungeon before you even make it to the higher levels of the keep. So I was incredibly impressed. There's awesome artwork through. I love this is the actual water weird encounter where you can dive under the water and come up in the well. A lot of really cool stuff happening. I didn't even understand how the dungeon looked until I made it to these later areas. And we're like, oh, okay, so it's actually, there is a keep on top. You were literally started in the bottom end and work your way up, which is also a cool twist on a dungeon. That's why it requires you to capture the player so you can magically teleport them to that depths of the dungeon, which is a cool thing to do. Again, if you can pull it off, which I think is the only weakness of this adventure. You can see here's the actual surface level. So once you make it to this point, the whole time, I believe it's still supposed to be a surprise that Elias is the final boss. So he can spy on the players. So the only bummer is you've set up this cool villain, but you're not actually using the cool villain to like harass the players and create like a cool personality there. And that's partly because you want to have this fun final moment where he reveals himself and is, Elias, your great nemesis. And hopefully the players are like, who? You know? And that's a cool moment to go off, but on the other hand, you do kind of lose a little bit of that villain interaction. To make up for that, there are multiple goblin mini-bosses throughout the area of different factions and sections that you can run into, and if you take them out, that then makes the final boss encounter slightly easier because you don't have to deal with those mini-bosses, and they'll have their own like unique stat blocks and stuff going on. So once you actually make it to the keep courtyard area, you can... basically, if he spots you, he comes out in his robes and talks about the concert, then it could start a big boss fight there, or he could retreat and you might, stay hidden, and then he goes and does other things. It goes into his bed chambers eventually and, could find you there snooping around. The adventure does a good job of giving me so much information and options depending on where the players go and what they do. Here's where the patrol is over here. Here's where the patrol is there. If the players defeat this patrol, then those reinforcements won't appear over here, and if the players engage Elias here, then here are the patrols that'll come in here. If they let him go, then here's what's going on here. It does so many of those details and information. I was actually astonished by how much info is here. The whole adventure is basically just this one dungeon, but it is painstakingly detailed out and given so much information. You can see it's very well organized, well edited. I love the artwork to death. And it's a phenomenal adventure. It even includes notes on if your party, which if you've seen on the map, there are numerous escape tunnels, and of course they could just make it over land. I guess we'll go back to the other map. You can see all these arrows kind of pointing off. There are numerous escape tunnels, and the party could follow those tunnels up to the surface and even just try to hightail it and escape without actually defeating the big boss. And there are notes on how the goblins will chase them down and try to attack them if they actually manage to escape, or if they try to go back in and find a tunnel through there. And it thinks of everything, which is a hard thing to do in D&D because despite all the prepper you can do, the players are still going to think of something that you haven't thought of. But at the very least, if you get as much information as possible, that makes it that much easier to run, and that's something I very much appreciated. Chapter 4 is just the final boss fight. So it just notes that, hey, no matter how you've triggered this final encounter with Elias, whether you've met him in the courtyard, whether you've got him, with his proverbial pants down in his study, or wherever or he caught you all snooping around in the study because he's got, animated armor guards. He can kind of tell if somebody's been disturbing it. That will trigger the boss fight. And it has multiple encounters. It has multiple waves with huge groups of goblins. You can see here one of the things the goblins do is drink potions of giant size, which is a cool twist to do. Elias himself is a cool spellcaster who primarily does a bunch of like charming and paralyzation spells. Doesn't really do a whole lot of straight up evocation magic or anything, because he wants to knock the players out. He doesn't want to kill them. He wants to torture them. He wants to make them his kind of beloved slaves to enjoy his music, which is very just plain and okay. It's just a cool idea for a villain. There's a really fun monologue here, and it mentions the fact that he will try to cast Hold Person on as many people as possible and just monologue endlessly, which I find just completely delightful. So just a really, really cool adventure from start to beginning. I absolutely love the trajectory here. Hopefully the players will play along and be okay with being captured, because I think that's the only tricky part here. But once they're in the dungeon, I think it's extremely enjoyable from start to finish. There's safe places for them to rest and recuperate, because obviously it's a very long dungeon. But it ends up ending on a really fun note where the final reveal of Elias, you've made it to the top of this dungeon, there's goblins everywhere, and then once you actually defeat him, the goblins kind of shake it off and realize they've been magically enchanted this whole time. So I think that's a neat twist that can kind of, it's a load-bearing boss, basically. And then the final 20 pages are incredibly useful appendices, magic items that are used, a really, really fun section on how to expand goblins, because, again, when I first looked at it, I was like, okay, goblins, we've seen this to death. Everybody uses goblins. They're the perennial, tier 1 enemy, especially like level 1, level 2. We're level 6, so what are we doing with goblins still? Well, there's a lot of things you can do with goblins, including giving them a bunch of new actions, using a lot of unique stat blocks, using mini-bosses, and a lot of cool ideas. I'm skipping ahead because there was one I loved. The Goblin Torch, which is somebody who douses himself in oil and lights himself on fire. And it mentions that during most of the goblins in this keep have the wall climbing ability, where they can climb on the walls like alien style. I think it literally mentions the fact that, hey, be careful with the reinforcements because it will turn into aliens. But just the swarming nature of all these goblins, and then something like this Goblin Torch could just catapult themselves into players. And there are rules about that for goblins just launching themselves, and the actual final battle involves literal goblin catapults. So it really turns the whole goblin thing on its head, uses tactics in a really fun way, uses a lot of unique stat blocks and mini-bosses. You can see the NPCs involved here. This is the halfling that is magically charmed. There's also Elias's former mentor who you can find, who unfortunately has been almost magically lobotomized. You have to kind of greater restore her, but she's been enslaved by him as well to just make spell scrolls. So there's 2 different NPCs you can find in 2 different areas that could help you or hinder you, depending on how well you're able to kind of rescue them. Elias, of course, is given a very fancy stat block with all kinds of abilities and reactions, including whenever he could basically shove a goblin in front of him like a shield, like Princess Peach and Smash Brothers, and just hold that goblin there to take the fight. It's absolutely fantastic. I cannot say enough good things about this awesome adventure. It's got the maps, it's got the tokens, it's got the creatures, it's got a Spotify playlist if you wanted music. It's absolutely awesome. Let's go over my pros and cons for Death by Goblins. Pros: the Goblin Lair is an excellently designed mega dungeon with multiple paths and detailed patrols. Pro: several rescuable, that's a tricky word to say, prisoners with unique situations that help and hinder the party, which is important because you never want to be in a dungeon, especially this big, without some form of role-playing or social interaction. Obviously, prisoners are the best way to do that, and I like the fact that we get multiple prisoners. I didn't even go over, one of them is a goblin possessed by a nilbog, which is a creature that I'm not terribly familiar with. It's from one of the, I think it's from like Volo's Guide to Monsters or something, which is just a possessed creature that can just possess different goblins, and that thing can turn into a wild card at the end in terms of possessing some big bad goblins and take over the tribe. 20 plus pages of appendices, including expanded goblin actions, unique stat blocks, and mini-bosses. That's incredibly impressive. Fun original artwork and comic panels by the designer. Full color detailed DM and player maps of the dungeon. And legitimately funny and captivating BBEG with an epic final boss battle. I do really love Elias as a just toxic asshole for a villain who just wanted to capture the players just to kind of torture them slowly and kind of magically enslave them rather than have any kind of, big world-ending plans or dastardly schemes. Cons: my only real con, as I've mentioned, is that the adventure relies on successfully capturing the party, which is always going to be a tricky thing to do, and I don't think this adventure provides enough details or plan B's, C's, and D's for if your players are very on the ball about not being captured and very wary about what the ambush looks like and everything. That could unfortunately stall and derail the entire adventure. There needed to be more details and notes about how to properly capture them when all you're given is a bunch of goblins versus 6. The actual ambush event is fine, but then all you've got is goblins with a bunch of 6th level PCs, and I think that's pretty tricky to pull off. Final verdict: with a massive, incredibly detailed dungeon design, expanded goblin stat blocks, full color art tokens and maps, and a villain you love to hate, Death by Goblins is easily one of my favorite adventures of the year. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson, and you can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.